Hi there, AP Euro students. Today we're going to continue on with our lecture on the French Revolution. So when we last left off, we were talking about the progress of the revolution in late summer of 1789. By this point, the peasants in the countryside and the urban poor of Paris had risen up and used mob violence to essentially ensure the success of the revolution. Louis XVI, the King of France, was fully aware that he was losing control of his own country, and the newly formed National Assembly was assuming sovereign power on behalf of the people of the nation. So by August of 1789, the newly formed National Assembly began to act like an actual legislature and began to pass laws and enact policies that were adopted by the rest of France. For example, one of the first and most important developments was the abolition of feudalism and any of the traditions and characteristics that came with it. This had been one of the leading demands of the peasants of France, who made up the majority of the population. And also, when this was established, when feudalism was abolished, the peasants were happy. They had met their primary goal in the revolution. One of the most important moments in the emerging French Revolution was when the National Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This is essentially France's version of the Declaration of Independence. They're not declaring themselves independent from another nation like the American colonists were. They're essentially declaring themselves independent of the old regime. They are declaring their emphasis on Enlightenment values of liberty and fraternity and equality. They are declaring their intention to create a constitutional government. This really, like I said, is a very, very important document in modern France. It's still seen as, again, one of their founding documents. So where we're really going to pick up today is talking about the rights of women during the French Revolution, which is a really interesting topic because there is some progress for women's rights during the French Revolution, more so than, frankly, we've seen before. But ultimately, there is still a lot of hypocrisy among the leaders of the French Revolution, because when they speak of, equality and liberty and equal citizenship, they really do not intend for it to fully apply to women. So, what are some of the things that women did achieve during the revolution? Women gained some increased rights. This included the right to divorce, the right to inherit property, and the right to get child support from the fathers of their illegitimate children. So these are more or less kind of family issues that helped and supported women: divorce, inheriting property, and getting child support. But women, however, did not share in equal political rights. For example, women were not allowed to vote. They were not allowed to hold office. And even though they did have some new rights and advantages in sort of the domestic realm with right to divorce and inherit property, the existing system still gave men the advantage in family law and property rights and education. So women still did not have the same opportunities as men, and the system still favored male privilege over women. At this point in history, even despite all the Enlightenment philosophy, there were very, very few men who believed in gender equality. I think one of the only philosophers and leaders of the revolution who supported gender equality was the Marquis de Condorcet, who was one of our Enlightenment readings. You may remember that when we studied the Enlightenment. But again, he was a single voice. He was, which was a very small minority. The vast majority of the men leading the revolution did not see this as a legitimate issue. In the early stages of the revolution, which is sort of where we are now in the first year or two, when there's still a lot of optimism and hope, many women were hopeful that the revolution would allow them to gain more rights. Many women were very, very supportive of the revolution, like we will see here on the next slide. and especially educated women tried to participate in the revolution by forming clubs and debating politics. Now, during the course of the revolution, there's also a few notable publications. We've talked about Mary Wollstonecraft, we'll mention her again, but one of the most famous advocates for women's equality during the French Revolution is Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges was a progressive revolutionary. She wrote essentially a counterpoint to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Hers was called the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, and it was published in 1791, which will be the same year as the new Constitution, which we'll learn about shortly. She basically mimicked all of the same 17 articles found in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but she applied them explicitly to women in each case and adapted them to suit the needs of women. So this was in the long run, this is a very famous document, but at the time, most revolutionary leaders sort of just turned their noses up at it. Even beyond the publication of her declaration, Olympe de Gouges also made public speeches that asserted the right of women to divorce in certain conditions. She supported women being able to control property in marriage. She supported the right for illegitimate children to inherit property. She wanted women to have equal access to higher education and access to civilian careers and public employment. And some of those later ideas were considered really radical at the time, especially in terms of, their ideas around gender equality. Ironically, though, Olympe de Gouges would actually be a victim of the revolution during the Reign of Terror. She would be executed with the guillotine because during the Reign of Terror, which we'll learn about shortly, she actually aligned herself with some of the more moderate factions. And as we will learn, the moderate factions will be the ones that are targeted by the radical government in charge at that time during the Reign of Terror. But still, Olympe de Gouges was probably one of the most important advocates for female equality during the Revolution. We've learned about Mary Wollstonecraft a little bit already. Mary Wollstonecraft was an advocate for women's rights in England. And she also called out the hypocrisy of French revolutionary leaders in her publication, The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And her ideas were very similar to Olympe de Gouges. In many ways, she argued for equality, especially equality in access to education. She believed that women were capable of all the things that men were. And so as a result, Mary Wollstonecraft is really considered to be the founder of modern feminism. And her work does become a little bit more widely read and revered in the long run, more so than Olympe de Gouges, which is why we see Mary Wollstonecraft as the founder of modern feminism. Olympe de Gouges is more specifically associated with the French Revolution. There's also Madame de Staël. Madame de Staël had run salons prior to the Revolution, and she also was an author in her own right. She wrote several widely read books. And she became a harsh critic of the revolution. She deplored the subordination of women to men in general. And she also was very critical of the revolution for doing so little to change this relationship dynamic of women being subordinate to men. Now, a bit later in the revolution, in 1793, when we kind of get into the radical, violent phase, there is a sort of political club specifically for women that emerges. It's called the Society of Republican Revolutionary Women. This society was founded in 1793, and it largely consisted of working class women in Paris. And we will learn that the working class of Paris were very, very involved with the radical phase of the revolution. And these women vowed to rush to the defense of the fatherland. They vowed to live for the republic or to die for it. So they were very, very devoted to this idea of the French Republic. Women in this group often wore decorated red bonnets what a bonnet is like a sort of little hat to signal their membership. But this also sometimes provoked violence against them. because there were still many people who believed women should not be participating in politics, and these women were trying to, organize and have a voice and show their support. But the Society of Republican Revolutionary Women would actually be dissolved during the Reign of Terror, when Jacobin leaders like Robespierre and Danton, who we'll learn about shortly, targeted the leaders of this group. Not for any particular reason other than they perceived them as a potential enemy of the revolution, which is the rationale behind why Robespierre would target anyone in the Reign of Terror. But we'll get more into that later. Still, women played an important role throughout the French Revolution, especially in their participation as part of the Parisian mob. And there is no more famous event for women in the Parisian mob than the Women's March to Versailles. This is a really big moment in the French Revolution. So, in October of 1789, rumors start to circulate in Paris. These rumors specifically were incited by Jean-Paul Marat. And these rumors said that the palace, the king and queen in the palace, were actually hoarding, meaning they were gathering grain and bread and hiding it in the palace and keeping it from the people of Paris. And so these rumors, again, encouraged by Jean-Paul Marat, start to develop, again, an angry female mob. And we will learn that these women will ultimately push the revolution forward, especially in the wake of these persistent bread shortages, right? It's October. The revolution has been going on since about June, but there's still no bread. So these women are like, damn it, we're going to do something about it. So in October of 1789, about 7,000 women, along with members of the Parisian National Guard and of course many male supporters, marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles. And as they marched, they were going to demand that the king address their economic issues. A lot of these women had been living a really, really difficult life. A lot of women were now unemployed because many women often worked in textile industries or cottage industries, and there was a reduced demand for garments. And so this had devastated some of the employment that was available to women. And also these women were the ones that stood in line to get bread during the shortages. They were the ones that saw their children go hungry. And so finally in October, they decided they had enough. And these rumors that Marie Antoinette and Louis were hoarding grain in the palace whipped them into this mob frenzy. So they marched the 12 miles to Versailles. And here we have thousands of angry women surrounding the palace. These women ultimately managed to break into the palace. They were able to overwhelm the palace guards, broke into the palace, running from room to room, searching for Marie Antoinette. And they slaughtered any bodyguards or anyone who got in their way looking for Marie Antoinette. Marie Antoinette escaped the angry mob of women just in the nick of time by running through a secret passageway out of her bedroom into a secret hallway so she could get into Louis XVI's bedroom. So that's how she was able to survive. There's also an important sort of little story I want to tell at this point about this famous quote that Marie Antoinette supposedly said, which is, "Let them eat cake." So you might have heard of this before. Supposedly that when the women gathered around the Palace of Versailles, Marie Antoinette was looking outside and she asked her servant, she's like, what do they want? What do they want? Why are all these women here? And the servant says, "Your Majesty, they want bread. They don't have any bread." And Marie Antoinette's like, "Well, if they don't have any bread, then just let them eat cake." And so, of course, this story shows how flippant and out of touch Marie Antoinette was with the reality of working women. But actually, the story is completely made up. It is completely made up. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake," at least as far as we know of. But this is an example of one of those historical rumors that is created to create a certain image and characterization of a person in history, of course, trying to make Marie Antoinette seem like she's elitist and flippant and out of touch. Anyways, there was no escaping this angry mob of women, and so the king was forced to agree ultimately to the demands of the mob. He agreed to distribute any bread and grain that the palace had hoarded or had in its storage. He accepted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And the most important one is that the women demanded that the royal family leave Versailles and move back to Paris to see how real citizens lived. And so the next day, the royal family loaded themselves into their carriage and they were escorted by the women all the way back to Paris, where they spent the remainder of the revolution and, frankly, their lives in the royal residence in Paris, which is a little sort of house called Tuileries. You don't have to worry about writing that down. But basically, they're going to spend the rest of the revolution in Paris. And for Marie and Louis, that's the rest of their lives. And this was a huge victory for not only the women of Paris, but the people of Paris. They felt like they were able to go out there and pull the king off of his throne and make him, come to Paris and experience life with the working class. Louis also met with a group of women and signed decrees, meaning laws and policies that would guarantee bread in Paris at reasonable prices. Because remember, Louis had lifted price controls on bread, and that's one of the reasons there were bread shortages and people starving and all that stuff. All right, so the royal family has moved back to Paris, and with them, the National Assembly will also move to Paris. The National Assembly was also a bit intimidated by the angry Parisian mob, and rightly so. Who wouldn't be intimidated by a mob of 7,000 angry, hungry women? And so the National Assembly moves back to Paris as well. And again, this starts to demonstrate my theory that the bourgeoisie, the members of the National Assembly, they were the brain of the revolution. So they're the ones writing the Declaration of Independence. They're the ones abolishing feudalism. They're going to write a constitution here pretty soon. But it's also the peasants and the working class of Paris. They are really the muscle. They're the ones who are going to keep the revolution moving forward in many ways. So anyways, the National Assembly continues to develop as a more formal government. They reduce the king's power to essentially a temporary veto in the lawmaking process. The king and the assembly made sure that bread was available to the masses. That was the most important thing, obviously. And we will see ultimately that some of the more conservative revolutionaries that had, joined the Third Estate in the beginning of all of this during the summer of 1789, some of those more conservative revolutionaries actually began to distance themselves or drop out entirely from the National Assembly because they started to become very disillusioned by a lot of the mob violence because of course, the National Assembly and many of these revolutionary leaders will approve, if not fully condone, a lot of the mob violence because they feel it supports the revolution. Okay, moving on to the next year, 1790. In July 1790, there's a really important development. I mean, it's going to sound redundant. They're all important, but this one is really important. This development is called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy. And the Civil Constitution of the Clergy is basically the biggest mistake made by the National Assembly, and it represents its first significant failure. Essentially, what this does is it makes the Catholic Church an enemy of the revolution. So it makes the Catholic Church an enemy of the revolution, and it didn't really need to be an enemy of the revolution. So essentially, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy secularizes religion. What this means is it creates a national church, right? So the church becomes subordinate to the state in every way. The church is now controlled and organized by the state. So there'll be like 83 bishops and dioceses that will correspond with the new 83 districts in France that we'll see created by the Constitution. All convents and monasteries are abolished, so monastic orders were abolished in France, and a lot of church property was actually confiscated by the National Assembly and then sold to pay off the national debt of France. This is how the National Assembly dealt with the financial crisis, because even despite all of this, France was still in debt. This also this action of getting rid of convents and monasteries also significantly undermined not only the religious orders, the monks and the nuns, but also a lot of the schools that they controlled as well. Archbishops were also abolished, and all members of the clergy would now be paid by the state and elected by all citizens. And all citizens means the citizens that were not even Catholic. So Protestants, Jews, deists, they were all allowed to potentially take part in these elections of the clergy, based, of course, on citizenship, standing, and property qualification. The tithe was also abolished. Remember, the tithe was like the 10% church tax that was charged on everyone. And the clergy was also forced to take an oath of loyalty to the new government. This is one of the real conflicting issues here. Because remember, Catholic clergy is supposed to be loyal to the Pope first and foremost. But the Pope at this point had openly condemned the revolution. And so the National Assembly required clergymen in France to take an oath of loyalty to the new government, essentially replacing the authority to the Pope. The clergy was explicitly forbidden to accept the authority of the Pope. And as you can imagine, many members of the Catholic clergy did not ethically feel like they could do that. They could not ignore the authority of the Pope over the new government. So the result of all of this is that it deeply divided France over the issue of religion. Like I said, the Pope had condemned the revolution, and the civil constitution of the clergy essentially made the Catholic Church an enemy of the revolution. About half of all of the priests in France refused to accept this, which of course made them enemies of the revolution. And the backlash surrounding this, because this was a really, really controversial development, the backlash ultimately created the counter-revolutionary movement in France. And this is what I think is most important about this, is that the civil constitution of the clergy, because it was so controversial, fuels the counter-revolutionary movement. And so while we have a revolution taking place against the old regime government, a counter-revolution emerges to challenge the main revolution. And this creates essentially a civil war-like atmosphere in France for much of the revolution. Really, for the next 10 plus years, there's going to be this counter-revolutionary movement based mostly outside of Paris, but still there will be moments of civil war. There's going to be lots of tension and violence and chaos, ultimately, because of the counter-revolutionary movement. All right, moving on. Finally, in 1791, the first constitution of the French Revolution was created. This constitution established a constitutional monarchy, so it did not abolish the king, not yet anyway. And with the constitutional monarchy, there was now a unicameral legislative assembly. Unicameral means one house, whereas like our government in the United States is two houses, this is one house. So this new legislative assembly was made up of 745 elected men, and they passed the laws of the new nation. The middle class would now ultimately control the government because not everyone was allowed to vote. We do not see universal male suffrage. So there were property qualifications and age qualifications in order to be able to vote. And these qualifications really benefited the middle class. So the middle class, like I said, will essentially control this government. In this constitution, the nobility and all their privileges were abolished. So noble titles and privileges and inheritance was all abolished. Also, traditional provinces, so traditional sort of geographic divisions in France were abolished because of their connection to the nobility. And France was now divided into 83 departments governed by elected officials. And the purpose of this is that the government hopes to achieve greater national unity. There was a new system of law courts that finally gave France a uniform administrative structure, again, based on sort of the 83 departments and districts. And these 83 departments are actually still used to organize and divide France today. So you can think of them kind of like how we have our 50 states. France has its 83 districts that were created during the Revolution and are still in use today. The Constitution of 1709 also gave full citizenship to Protestants and Jews. It addressed the issue of religious intolerance, which had been one of the leading grievances during the Enlightenment. The Constitution also abolished guilds. This is a major social change because guilds had played a significant role in urban areas since the Middle Ages, so it got rid of guilds. It also abolished slavery in France, like in the nation of France, but it did not yet abolish slavery in France's colonies. However, one of the biggest weaknesses of this constitution is that since it divided France into these 83 different districts, local communities were able to enforce national level legislation at their own discretion. So in each of these 83 districts, there were like little officials that were elected to govern the district. And because of essentially a lack of oversight, they had a lot of power over their district and could enforce national laws, national legislation at their own discretion. And this becomes a really, really big issue when war emerges in France, because we'll see that not only is France sort of fighting a civil war, but they're also going to be, before long, fighting a war with like the rest of Europe. All right. In the wake of all of this, as France is clearly, moving farther and farther away from the old regime, the royal family, which for the past year or so has been living in Paris, decides to try to make a run for it. And this event is called the Flight to Varennes. So in June of 1791, Louis XVI tried to escape France. And what motivated this is he wanted to avoid having to approve this new constitution of 1791 because it ultimately required his approval, technically, but they would have found a way around it. So he wanted to get out of France. He didn't want to sign this constitution. He also wanted to raise a counter-revolutionary army with allies, say, in Prussia and Austria, and seek help from these foreign powers so that he could invade and reconquer France. So the king and the queen and their children are able to sneak out of their palace at night with the help of some friends. They load themselves into a carriage. The carriage makes it all the way to the border. They're almost all the way to the border, and then they're stopped, and they have to pay a toll at one of the crossings. And supposedly, the guard at one of these tolls recognized the king because the king's face was on all the coinage of France. And so he recognized, oh, this is the royal family trying to escape and make a run for it. So not surprisingly, they are captured and they were brought back to Paris where they were essentially became prisoners. They still got to stay in kind of the nicer, royal residence, but they essentially were prisoners. And you can imagine that this did not improve public opinion of the monarchy. In fact, the king was now viewed by many as a traitor to his country, and he lost what little public support that remained for him. And of course, he was forced to accept the new constitution and declare France a constitutional monarchy. So you may be wondering to yourself, what does the rest of Europe think about this? what does the rest of Europe think about what's going on in France? Well, one of the most famous reactions to the French Revolution comes from the English nobleman Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke uh, is one of the most famous sort of intellectuals who defends traditional European conservatism. Conservatism basically will become to mean like the old regime and all of its institutions and traditions and ideas, so like monarchy and nobility and privilege and things like that. So Edmund Burke responded to the revolution through this writing. It's called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And in this, he defended the inherited privileges of the monarchy and the nobility, saying that this is necessary to maintaining order in society. He predicted that France would dissolve into anarchy and dictatorship because of these radical revolutionaries. He also advised England, right? It's like England can learn something from this. So he advised England to go slow in adapting its own liberties, right? He didn't want the same thing to happen in England that was happening in France. He also denounced political philosophy based on abstract principles of right and wrong. So basically, he denounces a lot of the political philosophy that is driving the French Revolution. And he believed that nations should be shaped and formed by national circumstance, national history, and national character, not by revolutions. Eventually, Burke came to urge war against France as part of an ideological struggle against French barbarism and French radicalism. And England will definitely go to war with France. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. Edmund Burke, beyond condemning the French Revolution, however, is a really famous author and intellectual in British history, and there's a lot of fun quotes from him. The two I included here are two of my favorites. One you can see says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." And I think that's still a quote that has a lot of resonance in the modern world. And the other one, you may have heard this before, "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." That's, of course, something I frequently hear as a history teacher, and I think that's also a lesson that we should always keep in the back of our mind. And again, it's a great justification for learning, sitting in this classroom and learning history day to day. Okay, another reaction, a more supportive reaction to the French Revolution came from Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was an American political activist, political philosopher and theorist, and revolutionary. He had been very active in the American Revolution. And his writing, The Rights of Man, actually directly responded to Edmund Burke. And Thomas Paine defended Enlightenment principles, and he defended France's revolution. Of course, as an American revolutionary, he saw some camaraderie with the French revolutionaries. And he saw the French Revolution as an example of the triumph of liberty over authoritarianism, just like how the American colonists had triumphed in their independence against Great Britain. Now, in general, kings and nobles all across Europe felt threatened. They were freaked out by the French Revolution. Initially, some of France's rivals may have initially supported the revolution because they thought it would weaken France as an international power. But before long, they came to fear the revolution because it became more and more radical and specifically targets the traditional elite like monarchs and nobles. People also began to fear that the revolution would spread beyond France, that it would encourage peasant uprisings in other countries. And this fear that the revolution would spread ultimately encouraged the use of military action against France. And so we will see very, very shortly that war is going to erupt in Europe between France and several other nations. So now France is a constitutional monarchy. It is not a republic, not yet. That's still seen as a bit too radical. But there are many people pushing for more radical positions, like being a republic and getting rid of the monarchy and things like that. So, in the first year or so of this new government, this new constitutional monarchy, there's going to be some significant challenges to the legislative assembly. So, the Legislative Assembly, like I said, was the new legislature formed and established with the Constitution of 1791, and the Legislative Assembly had formally replaced the original National Assembly. And the members of that original National Assembly, the ones that had gathered at Versailles and ultimately begun the revolution, they agreed that no one from that group would take part in the new government. So the new Legislative Assembly is an entirely new group of men in the government. And this new government reflected the emergence of political factions. All right, political factions are like different political teams, political parties, and these political factions start to compete for power. And they had different ideas of what type of government they wanted, or what they wanted to prioritize in the new government. And some of the most important and powerful factions were Republican factions. And in this context, Republican does not mean conservative like it does in the modern day United States. Republican means more radical, because these are people who supported the establishment of a republic, which means a government with no king in it at all. And that was seen as the more radical position at the time. And Republican members of the legislature tended to be younger and less cautious than the original members of the National Assembly. Overall, we start to see more lawyers, more property owners, again, members of the bourgeoisie in this Legislative Assembly. And supposedly, the origins of what we consider to be like right and left in terms of politics come from this period in France in the Legislative Assembly. I don't know if this is true, but it's a fun story, so I'll tell it anyway. Supposedly, in the National Assembly, which this big meeting hall, they said that the Republicans, the more radical and progressive factions, would sit on the left side of the hall, and the royalists, or more moderate factions, would sit on the right side of the hall. And in politics today, we tend to consider groups that are more conservative or traditional to be right-wing, and groups that are more radical or more progressive to be left-wing. And supposedly that association comes from this point in the French Revolution, which is interesting. Anyways, one of the most important and famous of the factions was a group known as the Jacobins, and they will rise to power during 1791 and 92. By 1790, even before the Constitution had been implemented, different political parties had begun to spring up, just like we have different political parties in the United States. Different political parties emerged in France, although they were much more numerous, and they were organized as clubs. So the Jacobins are one of these political parties named after their club, and the Jacobins will come to dominate the Legislative Assembly. The Jacobins were passionately committed to a liberal revolution, meaning they wanted a republic. They wanted to get rid of the monarchy altogether and establish a republic. And they became increasingly radicalized because they thought that other factions resisted them. They became very radicalized and began to think, like, if you're not with us, then you're against us, right? They were unwilling to compromise. The Jacobins would also be the group that advocated for war and led the country into a war, and they claimed this was an effort to defend the revolution. And so this starts to demonstrate some emerging domestic problems in France. The nation is starting to become very, very polarized, not only in the different political factions within the National Assembly, but don't forget about that counter-revolutionary movement that has been established that does actively try to undermine the revolution at times. And this polarization will ultimately increase economic and political chaos in France. So France is by no means stable at this point, all right? Simply because they have a constitution, that does not mean there's any type of stability going on. And it does not get any better when war breaks out either. So in August of 1791, Prussia and Austria issued what is called the Declaration of Pillnitz. The Declaration of Pillnitz was essentially a threat against France. They threatened to wage war against France as a result of the revolution. Now, French nobles who had fled France in the early days of the revolution, many of them had gone to Prussia and Austria and encouraged these other states to help them restore the French monarchy and bring an end to the revolution. I mean, for many French nobles, they saw this kind of like as a holy war. And also we will see so do the Jacobins and the French revolutionaries. And so the Declaration of Pillnitz really came from Austria. Austria is like, all right, France, if you don't knock it off, then we are going to invade and we're going to declare war against you. However, the declaration was really intended as a bluff. They hoped that this would simply slow down the revolution, and the Austrian Emperor Leopold was actually only willing to take military action if all the other powers joined him. And at this point, there was not unanimous agreement on whether or not to invade France among the great powers. And also, frankly, Leopold, the Emperor of Austria, was hoping to get rid of some of the French noble sort of refugees in his country. He wanted to get rid of them. And so he hoped that the Declaration of Pillnitz would simply slow things down. But Leopold grossly misjudged French revolutionary sentiment, and especially Republican sentiment, because essentially when Austria threatens war against France, France is going to respond by saying, bring it on, Austria. Bring it on. We will fight you tooth and nail to the end. We are not scared of you. And so, in response to the Declaration of Pillnitz, France will eventually declare war against Austria. And this begins what we call the War of the First Coalition. And that should be an indication that there's going to be more wars to follow the First Coalition. So France declares war against Austria. And many people in France were very supportive of the war, albeit for different reasons. Reactionaries, so some of the more moderate factions in France, including some of the counter-revolutionaries, hoped that the war would cool down. It would slow down the revolution and allow cooler heads to prevail. But the leftists and the radicals, especially the Jacobins, thought that now the war could help them spread the revolution. Not only would they have a revolution in France, but they could spread this revolution to other countries in Europe. Now, initially, French revolutionary forces would be soundly defeated by the Austrian military in the early battles, but they will ultimately kind of redevelop the army and make a lot more progress later on. And one of the only reasons, actually, this is interesting, one of the only reasons France was not immediately defeated, because like I said, their army wasn't doing well, is because of the partition of Poland. At the same point, Prussia, Austria, and Russia were in intense diplomatic negotiations over the division of Poland. And so we can actually thank Poland for distracting Austria long enough for France to get their military act together. But still, these early losses in battle caused a lot of tension in France. For example, the Jacobins blamed these early defeats on Louis XVI. They said it was his fault because they believed that he was part of this grand conspiracy with Prussia and Austria. But regardless, the declaration of war is a major page turner in the process of the French Revolution. Because now the stakes are higher, right? France isn't only isn't just going through a revolution. They're going through a revolution They're fighting a civil war, and now they're fighting a foreign war. And so, with these high stakes, this is what I want you to keep in mind. The declaration of war would lead to the second and radical phase of the revolution, where we will see the formation of a republic and ultimately the formation of a Jacobin-dominated dictatorship that will impose the reign of terror. But for now, we're going to take a brief break, and when we come back from break, we will pick up with the second or the radical phase of the French Revolution.